Made in China. For decades it meant cheap labor, knockoffs, and more recently mass-produced crap from Temu. But that myth is collapsing fast. While the US is trying to bring factories home with tariffs and subsidies, China is already building the future. Faster, cheaper, and at a scale that no one else can match. There's a new global power struggle happening right now, fought not with weapons, but with factories, chips, and supply chains. And right now, China is winning. For years, the West saw China as a copycat. They can make cheap things, but they were not innovative. They were good at scaling and assembling, but not at building anything advanced on their own. It's a place that puts together the iPhone, but cannot design anything better. But in 2025, that image doesn't hold up anymore. Because today, China is not just the world's biggest manufacturer, it's also increasingly becoming the world's most technologically advanced country. China now accounts for 31.6% of global manufacturing output, more than the US, Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. It's expected to go up to 40% in 2030. And it's also very advanced in high-value industries. For example, in the area of energy and transportation, electric batteries, high-speed rail. If you're talking about IT, things like semiconductors and 5G infrastructure. And in military and aerospace, China built some of the best hypersonic missiles, drones, and other autonomous systems. And of course, bringing it back home to advanced manufacturing, China is one of the world's leaders in robotics and smart factories. These are high-tech and critical sectors because they are super important to energy production, military strength, economic power, and global influence. Let's now talk about the bigger picture. This shift really matters because of where we are right now, which is a full-blown US-China trade and technology war. Trump talks about tariffs to correct import and export imbalances and bringing back factory jobs.
Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. We will supercharge our domestic industrial base. We will pry open foreign markets.
Underneath that is a deeper fear of China. The fear that China now has both the industrial base and the technological capability to challenge the US as the world's most dominant power. That's why there's a very strong fear-inducing narrative in the US-China trade war about manufacturing.
Foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream.
For the last 20 years, US companies outsourced their production to save costs. They lost skills, toolings, and their own industrial ecosystems. They became dependent on foreign suppliers for their own core technologies. Without a strong manufacturing base, if things go really bad during a crisis, then you have to depend on others to help you. During COVID, the US found out that they had to depend on other countries, most notably China, for pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, and even masks. Even today, supply chain for industrial products like machines, tools, chips for computers is all mostly overseas. Imagine a war breaks out today and you can't produce the goods you need to sustain your economy, and your rival is the one that is producing those things. Well, no matter how rich and powerful your economy is, there's no way around it. One word from Xi Jinping, you're screwed. Manufacturing doesn't just support war. In a very real way, it is in itself a war. That's why these tariffs are meant to encourage US companies to bring manufacturing back home, by discouraging American companies that manufacture in China and also make Chinese imports more expensive. Trump's government is also afraid that if US companies continue to stay in China, they continue to expose themselves to being copied by the Chinese competitors. And then they could make the same things a lot cheaper and push US firms out of the market. Here's an example of how a whole industry that was dominated by the US was lost to China. In the early 2000s, the US led the world in solar panel innovation and production. But to cut costs, American companies began outsourcing their manufacturing to China. This gave Chinese factories access to US technology, equipment, and processes. Basically, knowledge on how to make solar panels at scale. Over time, the Chinese absorbed this knowledge, improved their own capabilities, and launched their own competitors, like LONGi and Jinko Solar. And to make things worse, these competitors were backed by the Chinese government. They received heavy subsidies to operate at a massive scale. They could use much cheaper labor, sell below cost, and undercut the Americans on price. US companies still depended on China to produce their solar panels couldn't compete. And fast forward to today, China has taken over more than 90% of the global solar panel production. Basically, they own nearly the entire supply chain and effectively wiped out US solar manufacturers. This is a warning story for Washington for what happens when the US offloads their manufacturing to their biggest rival. China did not just rely on being cheaper. It produced better solar panels using the American competitors as their classrooms to learn. The US essentially handed China the playbook. And that's the risk that the US government feels it faces with today's critical technology sectors: electric vehicles, batteries, AI hardware, and chips. It's not just Trump pushing tariffs to break this cycle. Biden also recognized how urgent the situation is. For example, he rolled out the CHIPS and Science Act, which is a $52 billion plan to bring semiconductor production back to the US. He also had the Inflation Reduction Act, which included major subsidies for battery manufacturing, EV production, and domestic clean energy supply chains. The US government, regardless of Republican or Democrat, wants to break dependence on China. They want to prevent leakage of their own intellectual property and rebuild US manufacturing, especially in important technologies.
We are now making it clear to China that after years of targeting our industries and stealing our intellectual property, the theft of American jobs and wealth has come to an end.
China currently already has the ability to threaten the USA's position as the number one superpower in the world. And that's why the US government seems so afraid of China. And yet, when you listen to how most people still talk about China, you think that they are still cheap labor and knockoffs. But the truth is, China has evolved beyond just that. And if we want to rewire what we think of China, we need to start unpacking these myths. Starting with myth 1, China only makes cheap and low-end stuff. This is the go-to stereotype. Made in China equals cheap junk. When people hear made in China, they think of low-quality crap, cheap toys, knockoff electronics, and fast fashion. And yeah, that was true in the 90s and early 2000s. Back then, textiles and low-end goods made up 30 to 40% of China's exports. But today, the number has dropped to under 10%. Don't get me wrong, they still make these things, but it's not the whole story anymore. Now, higher value goods like machinery, electronics, and electric vehicles make up nearly 50% of China's exports. We already talked about solar panels, so let's take vehicles for the next example. In 2023, China exported 4.1 million vehicles, surpassing Japan to become the number one car exporter in the world. And a big chunk of that, 31%, is electric cars. BYD, for instance, sold more cars than Tesla globally in 2024. Across other sectors like drones, DJI owns 70 to 80% of the global drone market used by consumers and militaries alike. And don't forget their giants like Xiaomi and Huawei. They started with smartphones, but they're now building EVs, smartwatches, and robotics. They're not just building all this high-tech stuff, but they are inventing new ones and designing them too. Which brings us to myth 2. China just assembles what the West invents. A lot of Westerners still think that China is just a huge factory. Well, that used to be true. In the early 2000s, China was known as the world's workshop. Western companies like Apple, Dell, and HP designed their products in the US and had them assembled in China to save money. China was great at scale, cheap labor, and logistics. But the high-value work like intellectual property, research and development, as well as branding, was still Western. Not anymore. China is now able to do everything from raw materials to the finished product. Starting from raw materials, China dominates rare earth mining, lithium processing, and all the battery materials. And if you're talking about the components that make up all these high-tech products, like chips, displays, motors, and sensors, they're all increasingly made in China. Moving to design and engineering, Chinese firms are building their own platforms, architectures, and control systems. And as for branding, Chinese brands like BYD, DJI, and Huawei are all global household names. For example, Huawei doesn't just assemble phones. They manufacture their own chips, build their own operating system, and 5G infrastructure. BYD makes their own electric cars completely from scratch, which Tesla doesn't do. From the electric batteries, motors, semiconductors, to the vehicle bodies. DJI designs their own drone hardware, software, and flight systems from scratch. And you might think, oh, a lot of these are just inferior copies of the Western companies. Wrong. Which brings us to myth 3. China doesn't innovate. The assumption is that China can copy and mass produce things, but it cannot come up with anything new and original. That's no longer the case. China isn't just catching up in innovation. In a lot of areas, it's already overtaken the West. According to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, China now leads in 57 out of 64 critical technologies they track globally. These technologies are really critical because they are the foundations of economic power, military strength, energy production, and national security. And China is leading in technologies such as drones, hypersonic weapons, electric batteries, AI chips, and cybersecurity infrastructure. In fact, in 24 out of those 57 critical technologies, China's dominance is so strong they are classified as monopoly risk, meaning that no other country is even close to them. For example, China is building electric vehicles that are half the price of Teslas and charge in 30 minutes. They have drones that dominate global markets, from aerial filming to military use. Their smart home ecosystems are more affordable and more integrated than anything Apple or Google sells. They export battery systems powering solar grids in Africa, other parts of Asia, as well as EVs in Europe. They can build 5G infrastructure that's already been rolled out across the world, largely built by Chinese firms like Huawei. And if you want a clear example of how far China's innovation has come, just look at the electric vehicle industry, where Chinese companies are winning. Let's look at the famous BYD.
No company makes or sells more than BYD.
Their Seagull EV starts at under $11,000 and charges in about 30 minutes. It's built entirely in-house, from the batteries to the chips, software, and the vehicle body. Tesla, by comparison, is more expensive. Their cheapest Model 3 is 3 to 6 times more expensive. And now you see, while Elon Musk wants tariffs, Tesla is also falling behind on their battery innovation and is increasingly reliant on its gigafactory in Shanghai to stay competitive. In early 2025, Tesla's sales in China dropped 49% in a single month, its lowest since 2022. Meanwhile, BYD sold more cars than Tesla's globally in 2024. And their competition is not even close in China. Elon Musk may have kicked off the EV revolution, but China has already figured out how to build it better, faster, and cheaper. And the reason why China's EV industry is so strong is that the entire supply chain is local and integrated, from the batteries, the chips, the motors, to the software and final assembly. And this includes even raw materials like lithium and other rare earth elements. It's so developed that even Tesla's batteries are made by a Chinese company, CATL. I was actually in China last year in Guangzhou, and literally the streets are dead quiet. No engine sounds, because it's almost all electric vehicles. I even saw companies that were supposed to be making mobile phones like Huawei and Xiaomi selling their electric cars in shopping malls. And I think that says it all. Honestly, I don't see how the West can compete with China in electric vehicles. So yes, we need to accept that in a lot of areas, China is innovating and leading the race. And there's another assumption that a lot of people have, and it's that China is winning because the cost there, like salaries and raw materials, are much cheaper. Which brings us to myth 4. China's advantage is just cheap labor. Well, again, following the theme, this used to be true. But that's not China's main advantage today. In fact, in manufacturing hubs like Shenzhen, wages have increased. They now rival Eastern Europe, about $600 to $1,000 a month. They might still sound dirt cheap by Western standards, but here's the thing. China is no longer the cheapest place to make things. If companies want to go for the cheapest, they go to Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico, India, and Indonesia. What China really has now that no one else has is the best systems that support manufacturing and innovation. They have integrated supply chain ecosystems, which means you can go from raw material to finished product within a single region in China. The component shops, equipment suppliers, and packaging factories are all clustered together. Meanwhile, in the US, much of the tooling industry has left the country decades ago and hasn't come back.
There's a confusion about China, and let me at least give you my opinion. The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. The reason is because of the skill, the quantity of skill in one location, and the type of skill it is. Like the products we do require really advanced tooling, and the precision that you have to have in tooling and working with the materials that we do are state of the art. And the tooling skill is very deep here. You know, in the US you could have a meeting of tooling engineers and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China you could fill multiple football fields. It's that vocational expertise is very deep. Very, very deep here.
Over 10 million skilled technical workers come out of China's vocational schools every year. They come prepared with hands-on skills for manufacturing, robotics, and electronics. By comparison, the US only produces just over 1 million technical graduates every year, which is 10 times less. And as for infrastructure, China has the world's largest high-speed rail network. They have smart ports with 24/7 operations and factories run by AI. Meanwhile, in the US, the freight rail is outdated and aging. Ports are slower. Basic infrastructure upgrades take decades due to zoning and politics. And speaking about politics, China, being a one-party state, has a lot of government coordination. Local and national governments plan around industry goals. Like for example, if Beijing says it wants to develop the EV industry, all the local governments all over the country, in cities and towns, will find ways to support it. Land, workforce, permits, and subsidies get aligned at every level. Let's look at a specific example. Hangzhou, which is a city that is home to Alibaba, the famous DeepSeek, and a growing cluster of robotics and AI companies. It is a great example of this government and technology partnership. Hangzhou's government is actually working with these tech companies to test out their new AI innovations. For example, in March 2025, they rolled out an AI assistant powered by DeepSeek that helps citizens fill out forms, process documents, and navigate government services, all completely digitized and automated. Local governments aren't just supporting the tech companies, they're helping to test, deploy and scale their technologies. Another good example of how all this development is coordinated is looking at land and infrastructure, basically answering the question of why Chinese cities look so advanced. I actually did a video on this topic, links in the description, so check it out afterwards. The bottom line is that China's advantage isn't just lower cost, it's a whole ecosystem around innovating and building almost anything. It's the speed, the talent, the infrastructure, integration, and even the government coordination. And right now, the West needs to catch up. The phrase made in China used to mean cheap labor and mass-produced crap. Today, it means being a global powerhouse in high-tech industries and the ability to build almost anything super fast from scratch. It's not just the world's factory anymore, it's the most advanced one. That's why the US is scrambling through their tariffs and subsidies to catch up. Because this whole rivalry is not just about trade deficits and factory jobs. It's about who builds the future and becomes the center of global power. If you like this video, please do subscribe as it really helps me out. And although China is becoming a tech superpower, the reality on the ground for its younger generation is a lot darker. Many of whom are depressed, struggling to find jobs, afford housing, or build a future. I did a video on this youth crisis, so if you're interested, check it out right here. Peace.